All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're here to discuss healthcare and cybersecurity together with Hub Security's very own CRO, David Hochhauser, alongside a number of healthcare cybersecurity experts, including Tony Reina, Sher Baig, Tony Clarke, Martin Konish, Seth Carmody, and Iot. We'll start our webinar today with a brief introduction from David Hochhauser on today's discussion topic, and then our panelists will each get the chance to briefly introduce themselves. After, we'll get into a bit of a deeper discussion on everything related to healthcare cybersecurity, including its ongoing threats and solutions. And as usual, we'll leave 30 minutes at the end of the discussion for a short Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the discussion, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section below, and we will get to them later on. If you can't find the Q&A section, the chat works fine. Yeah. So now we have an impressive lineup of panelists tonight, and I'm excited to have them each introduce themselves to you. But first, we'll begin with a few words from David before we hand off the mic for introductions. Welcome, David Hochhauser.
Thank you, Sterny. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us. And hopefully also everybody is enjoying the snow. It seems to be snowing everywhere from New York to Texas to Jerusalem in the last 24 hours. So we have a lot in common there. We have a tremendous panel of experts with a range of security expertise, everything from healthcare and vendor organizations. And from a broad perspective, the general categories of topics will include, I'll talk about data sharing of health cyber threat info, as well as the health information itself. Iomt, or the Internet of Medical Things and Cybersecurity, some perspectives from outside the US as well. And just so you know, there are no hard boundaries around the topics though. So I'm sure we will branch off to other areas as the panelists feel are important as well. So I think it should be very interesting. And back to you, Sterny, to help move us along.
Thank you, David. Yeah, we're glad you could be here with us today as well. And I hope everyone's staying warm. We have about 2 feet here in Germany of snow. So I know I am trying to at least. But now I'd like just to take a few minutes to do a quick introduction round, starting with Martin. Would you mind giving our listeners a bit of background on yourself and your field of expertise and why you're here with us today?
Hi, everybody. Thank you that I can join you here. I work as a CIO for one of the bigger hospitals in Prague. We've got 1,200 beds in the hospital, 3,500 employees. My former career was as an enterprise and solution architect in financial and telco sector. And I'm here with you to share the in-field information about how we see it in a hospital in a country that is not the furthest in the digitalization.
Thank you, Martin. Sher, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. A quick mic check. Can you hear me okay? All right, fantastic. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Sher Baig, and I basically lead the global cyber product organization at G Healthcare. So for those of you who might not be familiar, G Healthcare, we're a global OEM, and we have one of the largest install bases as well with regards to medical devices. We have one of the largest multi-vendor medical device services businesses globally as well. And essentially what I do is my organization that I lead is responsible for building and taking to market new solutions and offerings for folks like Martin on the call. So hospitals and CIOs and CISOs in the HDO space, and that's what we lead. And I've been with G Healthcare for more years than I would like to say here, so I don't want to give away my age, but I've been here for a long time. And big part of the commercial medical device cybersecurity industry. So pleasure to be here and happy to have this conversation.
Great, thank you, Sher. We're glad you could be here with us today as well. And Tony, over to you. Tony Clarke. We have two Tonys here today.
Hi there. Tony Clarke's my name. I am CISO for Icon Clinical Research. So we're a clinical research organization that helps bring drugs to market. So we work with most of the pharmaceutical organizations, and we'll work in all phases of the clinical trial process. So we recruit patients and conduct the clinical trials on the different sites, analyze the data and help conform that to regulatory standards, create the regulatory submissions. We also have central labs to analyze samples globally, and we do medical device diagnostics research, and we're an organization of about 15,000 staff, and obviously my role is to make sure all that happens seamlessly and is secure. So I have a global team that work with to make sure our security program is commensurate with the regulatory environment, safeguard and protect our customer data and our own infrastructure and systems that process that information.
Big responsibility. Thank you. We're glad you could join us. Next, we have Seth Carmody.
Hey, everybody. Seth Carmody here. Bit of background about me. I'm currently at a security software startup called MedCrypt, but I spent basically the last 8 years living and breathing medical device cybersecurity. I was a cyber policy architect for a lot of the documents that you may or may not be familiar with that came out of the FDA with respect to cybersecurity. I've seen it all, but on response efforts with medical device manufacturers to healthcare delivery organizations during any number of response activities from WannaCry to NotPetya, and all the other ones in between. So happy to be here and share in that journey and things that I've learned.
We're also happy that you could be here. And we have next Anthony Reina.
Hi, I'm Tony. Hi, I'm Tony Reina. Although we have two Tonys on the line, so Sterny might refer to me as either G or Anthony, which is totally fine. I'm a physician and data scientist at Intel, and I serve as the chief AI architect for health and life sciences. My primary role is I lead a team in what's called privacy preserving machine learning. And so our typical use cases currently are in the health and life sciences, where you're trying to train AI models, which are kind of the latest, greatest kind of thing, in a way that protects patient confidentiality. So in accordance with HIPAA or GDPR, and looking at solutions for that, which opens up some security issues as well in its own right. So I'm a blessing and a curse at the same time. So thanks.
Great. We're glad that you could be here as well. And last but not least, we have Ray Diote.
Yeah, good morning, afternoon, and evening. Thanks for having me on today. I'm the Chief Data Officer for Healthcare and Life Sciences globally at NetApp. NetApp is a storage provider in on-premises cloud and edge use cases. And you might be wondering why we're here. We provide a fairly important portion of the security stack, especially around healthcare and life sciences when it comes to preserving and maintaining a significant data posture within the healthcare and life sciences space. Prior to being at NetApp, where I focus on strategy around data analytics and AI, I was the Chief Data Officer for a healthcare system here in Denver, Colorado, where we led a transformation around the data estate and data consumption, also focused on ensuring privacy, as Tony mentioned, around all the work that we were doing in AI when it comes to our patients, both health information as well as the IP created within the organization, all both targets of exploitation attacks. And thank you for having me here.
So we're glad that you could be here. Well, we have a few topics that we want to touch on, as David mentioned earlier. But I'm just going to jump right into it, talk a bit maybe about data sharing of health threat data and just generally health information. And I'll start with you, G. Anthony, can you describe maybe for our audience what federated learning is, as well as how and why it is being used to develop healthcare AI models right now?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you haven't heard of Federated, you hopefully will hear about it within the next year. It's becoming a really kind of hot topic. AI obviously is here and it's being used and it's productized, it's in scanners, it's in medical equipment. When I first heard Federated, I thought, oh, this is like, what is this, federal government or something like that? But the idea was coined by Google, and what they did is they were looking at their cell phones and basically with the predictive typing. So if I'm typing to my wife, hey, honey, I'm going to the store, would you like me to pick up a gallon of blank? That is an AI algorithm that's predicting milk. And so it helps you along as you're typing. And Google realized that it was going to be not very secure or private, let's say private, to actually read my messages. So they had to restructure how AI is kind of trained. And usually what happens in AI is the data comes to like a centralized server. It ends up getting trained at that centralized server, and then you get the model. And so Google said, you know, let's kind of turn it on its head and say, let's move the model out to the cell phones and train on the cell phones. And that way the data never actually has to leave the cell phone. It's really just the model that's going back and forth. So it's a way of basically training models, training AI models, training machine learning models without actually having to move data across. And that makes it very attractive to the healthcare space that patient records can stay in the hospital and never actually have to leave the premises.
Definitely. And maybe you can just describe briefly the additional security threat vectors that need to be considered by organizations when it comes to federated learning practices.
Yeah, absolutely. So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Second part to that question would be maybe some ideas on how to address these concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what my primary kind of job is. Our team looks at those security threats, and it sounds really great because we say, oh, the data's never leaving, you know. But if you know anything about these models, the idea is that the model is actually learning the statistics of the data. And so the model leaves, which means that the data in some form is actually leaving in the form of the model itself. And so it ends up opening up attack vectors there where, in particular, what we're being asked to do now is I'm sending some sort of algorithm to potentially untrusted nodes. I mean, okay, they're hospitals, but I don't control those hospitals. I don't control those sites. We're asking them to do a compute that we've asked them to do and send back an answer. And so I always say it's sort of like, you know, if you were to ask me, hey, Tony, for the next 7 days, go out and measure the temperature outside and report to me the average temperature, and I come back at the end of the week and give you, oh, it's 105 degrees Fahrenheit. You have no idea whether I'm just in a hot climate or whether it's a particularly hot week. You just have to accept the fact that I gave you a number and that's it. Federated's the same way, and if you don't trust what people are doing, or if you can't trust the answers that are coming back to you, people can do things like trying to spoil your federation, so the model never actually trains. So you've gone through all of this effort and you never get a model that actually does anything. They can also, and these are published attacks showing you can actually add backdoors into models. So if I'm like a, you know, tourism person or something like that, maybe I live in San Diego and I want to make sure that when the model predicts the weather in San Diego, it's predicting like 100 degrees all the time, and it's great and it's wonderful, and, you know, please come. Or it could even do something extremely nefarious, which is there are documented attacks where when people aren't doing the right thing in the Federation, they can actually get the data from other sites through the model through something called a model inversion attack. To solve that, what we've been trying to do is Intel and others have the concept of trusted execution environments. These exist now. They are hardware secured places where you've heard about security at rest and security in transit. This is encryption during use. So the actual CPU has instructions that will wall off cryptographically a section of compute and of memory. So you can't dump the memory unless you actually have the key. So you can do something on my computer if I allow you, and I can't actually look at inside what we call an enclave to see what's going on. And that's what we think solutions like that will help allow me to run something on your machine and make sure that you can't actually fool with it. You have to do what I'm asking you to do.
I have a final question for you, which is regarding equity. I mean, we've mentioned equity before in our webinars, and maybe you can briefly share with us how increased access to data can promote equity in healthcare generally.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really see this as near and dear to my heart, that there's definitely lots of issues with bias in AI models. And one of the inherent issues is that since it's hard to get access to lots of diverse data sets, we tend to have models that are trained on, maybe it's a lot of data, but it's a lot of data from the same population. And so I've always kind of had the phrase, if the model isn't working as well in Moscow as it is in Madrid, as it is in Madras, then there's probably something wrong with the model. It needs to be more generalizable. It needs to basically, if it's like the models that I work with are like brain tumor segmentation. So if I'm trying to identify a brain tumor in an MRI scan, it should work well in all of those cities. And so Federated actually allows you to get greater access to data in a privacy preserving way. And you can actually check that. You can actually say, I'm going to take this model and I'm going to try it in all 3 cities. And I can actually identify, I've got a bias. For some reason, it's not working well in this city. Why? Why is it not working well in that city? And it's the only way that you can kind of ensure in the wild that you're not really getting that bias. And hopefully by bringing in all of this additional data that you wouldn't normally have access to, you can actually reduce bias in these sorts of models.
I'm gonna shoot a question now over to our other Tony Clarke. Tony, you work in healthcare at ICON. What would you say were some of the biggest challenges that the industry faced over the last 12 months? There was COVID, there was a lot more going on, but definitely due to COVID, we saw many different kinds of attacks, including ransomware attacks. But maybe you could just outline for us some of the largest challenges that you saw the healthcare industry.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. And yeah, I mean, I think it comes as no surprise, right, that the pandemic and COVID-19 played a huge role last year. So, I mean, we work quite closely with H-ISAC and H-ISAC members, so you get a good sense of kind of the threat landscape that healthcare is facing. So, I mean, last year it really did follow the pandemic. So, like Q1 tended to be, particularly kind of, February, March tended to be around phishing and PPE scams. And, as the epicenter of the pandemic kind of changed, you'd see, phishing attacks that were maybe in Italian, etc., where that was kind of where the pandemic was hitting hardest. And then kind of as you moved into Q2, ransomware really took off. A lot of hospitals, a lot of big healthcare organizations got hit with ransomware. And then kind of Q3 tended to be, have a bit of more of a focus around organizations and organizations working on clinical trials and pharmaceutical companies. There tended to be a big focus on, criminal threat actors trying to monetize that situation, but also other entities, nation states, etc., trying to gain access to information about who's working on vaccines and what's going on from a vaccine development perspective. And then Q4, again, big focus on the vaccines, EMA and other organizations getting hit there. So even when vaccine candidates were being submitted, there was still a target for for threat actors. And the whole cold chain and kind of supply and distribution around COVID-19 vaccines. And then ransomware is still highly topical in Q4 and even the start of this year. So I think those trends are going to continue. Maybe a bit more of a focus on kind of distribution of vaccines probably spill over a little bit into the physical kind of world as well, in terms of trying to monetize that with scams and, you know, packaging, also, you know, trying to steal vaccines, and you know, that's the type of stuff that I think is going to be really kind of imminent and topical in terms of healthcare, and organizations making sure that they're prepared and able to defend against that. You know, ransomware, I think, is still going to be very topical this year.
Definitely been a tough year for healthcare.
Yeah, very much in the limelight.
And tell me, because I wanted to get your take on this, do you see value in sharing cyber threat information? And if yes, do you have any security or privacy concerns with sharing such info?
So I think it's hugely valuable. So, you know, there's kind of you can take a view that, you know, sharing an IOC, such as an IP address or an email address, is low value, right, in the context of a particular attack. But I think certainly the tools, techniques, and practices, the attribution to the extent it's possible, in kind of understanding the threat actors that are interested in your organization or your vertical or peers, I think that's hugely important. And I think the more sharing of information, the better. So H-ISAC is a great organization for sharing threat intelligence at that level. You know, it's not just through kind of manual email distribution lists. There's a whole, you know, automated threat intel platform mechanisms that people can ingest into their, you know, MISP instances, or, you know, other tip platforms. And I think there's a lot of value in, you know, proactively taking that information and pushing it to your environment, particularly if you know that it's, you know, that there's a high confidence level around it, right? So you're not going to get false positives, and that's something that you do get from those kind of community driven threat intelligence. So you know that if a member has shared some information, it's because of something that has happened, it's been validated, and you can have high confidence in it.
And in addition to sharing cyber threat info, are you also seeing healthcare companies sharing or wanting to share healthcare information generally with one another?
So yes and no. I mean, still very, you know, people are very aware of the compliance and the privacy and regulatory issues there, but increasingly more so for reasons that Tony has mentioned. They do want to get the benefits and the insight that is in that data. So there's, you know, a lot of healthcare organizations will work to maybe kind of see what additional insights they can get to with coupling the data they have with maybe you know, other healthcare records or other real world evidence, and other information that, you know, has been mined and maybe packaged by other organizations. So I think that yes, you know, healthcare organizations will share more data and will work with third parties to kind of supplement the information and data that they have. But there's still, you know, a regulatory concern around how they do that, and there's still a caution there, I would say.
Great, thank you, Tony. Ray, I'm gonna pass the mic over to you for a minute, and maybe you can tell us how has the healthcare sector generally been responding to the latest increase in cyber attacks? Maybe you can share with us a bit on that.
Yeah, so I think in general, you know, healthcare is typically behind and underfunds things like security, but I think we're getting better as a general rule in terms of, you know, becoming more aware of all of the threat vectors. I mean, you know, when I was in the, you know, in an IDN, a hospital setting, we focused on, you know, spam and phishing attacks, right? It was very basic what we were looking at, and I think as we've evolved over the last 3 or 4 years, there's become a much better realization of the breadth of attack vectors, both inside and outside of healthcare, and a new understanding that the power of the data that is within healthcare is exceptionally valuable to attackers, right? It's not just what they can do with the data, but it's how they can impact those lives. And understanding that and getting to the point where we're now doing a much better job of protecting it is really the biggest evolution. But I still think we have quite a long way to go as we start adding in consumer wearables, as we start adding Iomt, as we start doing the things that Tony R talks about in machine learning and AI, and as we start doing, you know, all of this data sharing between organizations, whether it's, you know, pharma and CROs, or between CROs, or as we talk about the health information exchange and moving that data between the hospital systems, specifically in the US, and then into the exchange for sharing and continuity of care, that opens up an entirely new vector for, you know, exploitation that isn't necessarily in our control, but we need to be exceptionally aware of as we engage in those partnerships.
Now that we are seeing more insider threats on the rise as well, what is being done to deter them within the healthcare and life sciences sectors?
Yeah, so insider threats are a really interesting thing. And coming out of the defense community, right, we always had a very keen eye on insider threat. And I think we have two variations of insider threat in healthcare. And one is the accidental insider threat, right? So we have, you know, admins who accidentally are deleting archives or deleting backups or accidentally clearing a table. And that type of mistake actually becomes a threat to the care delivery that we're trying to provide. So being able to look at things not just from a what's coming in from the outside, but also what's going on inside. Can we identify behaviors that are abnormal? Can we identify and prevent mistakes from arbitrary or accidental insider threat? Is truly, you know, necessary. And then there are people who, in order to do their job, are shipping data all around the healthcare system to their peers, to their bosses, outside of the system. And I think that's one area where it's, again, it's not malicious per se, but it is an area that we have to be really investing in securing that information and providing platforms for people to do their work and drive insight without having to insecurely share data between individuals and organizations, because that becomes, you know, again, a really big problem for how people are sharing data, how people are sharing shares, and how access is granted across the organization.
Definitely, that has a lot to do with IAM and PAM policies that are instituted at a higher level within the organization as well. And before I jump to my next question for you, I just want to remind everybody that we have Q&A at the end. So I see some of you are dropping your questions in the chat, which is great, but you can also drop them in the Q&A. And if you have a specific panelist that you'd like it to be directed to, feel free to write that there as well. So my last question for you, for now at least, Ray, is what do you see as the biggest opportunity for healthcare and life science organizations to transform and innovate in the?
Yeah, so I think it's a fantastic question, but the way I look at it, it's coming to the end state of having an end-to-end holistic security posture. You know, everything from looking at what's going on at the application in you know, the organizational tech or the OT, all the way down into the data layer and protecting archives, snapshots, things like that, that even though we have encryption, being able to avoid those, you know, ransomware threats that are coming in and taking months and years to evolve to credential up and then get into the archives. I think having that holistic strategy and evolving into that strategy from a security perspective, that you're protecting everything, and not having gaps in it, is the biggest area that we can transform in healthcare, and then be ready to secure and make private all of the things that are coming to us in terms of Iomt and the rest of the dynamic SaaS community that's going on that we deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Great, thank you so much, Ray. And I have a final question just for David while we're on this topic. With respect to machine learning and data sharing, what approaches are you seeing implemented in order to protect data and AI algorithms?
Okay, one, by the way, just to give you an idea of the value and the risk involved, just to start off, there was a 60-minute segment a couple of weeks ago, literally on the value of sharing DNA information in order to do AI. But half the segment was also on the effort that China's going through to steal all of our DNA information. So it kind of really puts back to back both the value and the risk. And I think that's what we're dealing with from that perspective. And I think this protection of the privacy of very sensitive medical data and applications, and even the AI algorithms we talked about and the models, it moves into an area that we call confidential computing, where in addition to all of the traditional security approaches, the data and apps actually have to be protected while executing as well, which is something that Tony G was implying and alluded to. So he discussed federated machine learning, which by itself technically doesn't fall into confidential computing, but I think is one really very innovative approach that goes a long way to start accomplishing this. There's still a need to protect the algorithms, the models, and there are ways to do that. Some of the ways, and they all have their pros and cons. One of them deals with something called homomorphic encryption, where the data is actually encrypted while being processed. So from what I've seen, it's kind of, that piece is still somewhat experimental and research just because of performance limitations, which defeats some of the data sharing. So that's a little bit, I think, further out there. More closer to home is maybe trusted computing approaches. We are actually hardening the hardware and computer operating environment so that you can't get access to the information while it's executing. And Intel XGS is probably the most common one, and something that Tony G mentioned as well, and the leading example. And that's actually one way of protecting things like federated machine learning. And of course, I have to mention Security's confidential computing platform, which can actually be used to protect both federated and non-federated collaborative data sharing and machine learning, even as well as general computing. And without getting into details, one key advantage is it actually maintains the extreme performance that you need while also providing the extreme privacy and security at the same time. So they all have, again, like I said, pros and cons at various things, but those are some of the approaches that I'm seeing out there, including our own, obviously, to protect it, so we can get the value and try to mitigate and reduce the risk at the same time.
Great, thank you, David. Sher, over to you now. Maybe you can share a bit with us, just based on your background at GE Healthcare and beyond, what are you hearing in the marketplace regarding the risks and threats for medical device cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the panelists touched on some key points there, so absolutely agreed with everything that was shared. And I'm sure folks who are joining too, a lot of them are aware that, unfortunately, healthcare is an industry that's really under attack, right? I mean, it's kind of where the finance industry was a decade ago, with more and more medical and clinical devices becoming network devices, smart devices. That risk has exponentially increased over time. From our vantage point and from mine, it's interesting because if you talk to a customer in South Africa, Malaysia, Singapore, UK, Germany, US, Canada, the situation on the clinical devices on the Iomt is the same, which is we have a good idea in some cases of how to manage the risk to some extent on the IT side, but we're struggling to determine what we need to do on the OT side, so the IoT and the Iomt space, because you cannot apply IT philosophy to a clinical device. And in G Healthcare, we're a medical device manufacturer, so we very much know that you cannot do certain things that you can do on IT assets to clinical devices. To give you some perspective, I think last year, over 86% of hospitals that were part of this study, one study that was conducted, said that they experienced some form of a security breach. On the clinical side of the house, your average cost of a data breach was about $3.5 million in 2018. It's now almost $7.5 million at the end of 2020. So that's giving you an idea that it's not getting better. It's almost like it's not a matter of if, it's more of a matter of when. So a lot of our customers that we're talking to globally, healthcare delivery organizations, that's becoming a very increased area of concern, is how do you manage medical device cybersecurity and IoT cybersecurity? Because in some cases, clinical engineering owns that space. But if you talk cybersecurity, they say it's an IT issue. You go talk to IT and sometimes, and they feel that, well, clinical device falls under maybe a separate space. So now these teams are coming together, IT and clinical engineering, they're coming together, which is a good thing, but bad actors are really taking advantage of this space. So I think this is an area which is very critical because, of course, it has direct impact to patient security and patient safety, medical records. And then there's such a difference between legacy medical devices, different types of medical devices, different modalities, from your PACS to your VNA to your software to your larger industrial products like your MRs. So this is a very, very critical space. And I think now a lot of CIOs and CISOs in the HDO space are looking at medical device cybersecurity very carefully because it's just becoming such an important area for them.
Definitely. And beyond simple increased collaboration, what are some other best practices that you would recommend around medical device cybersecurity that maybe you could share with us today?
Yeah, sure. So just at a very high level, a couple of things to keep in mind is there is no magic easy button out there, okay, that you press a button and you automate everything and you're good to go. Medical devices don't work that way. So you really need to take a very holistic approach. I think somebody mentioned that earlier and they're spot on. You have to take a very holistic approach in dealing with IoT and Iomt, and you have to take into account people, process, and technology. This is not a play which you can make just with a tool. It's not a play that you can make manually just by putting a lot of people into it. The days of conducting physical inventory and thinking that that's what's going to, give us the profile information of devices, and then we'll be able to, it's all reactive. And the name of the game with medical devices is in this space is you have to be as proactive as possible. So one, I would say definitely take a holistic approach. Do not rely only on a tool or only on one channel of strategy. You need to have people, process, and technology. And then when I mention holistic, we're G Healthcare, but the solutions we're putting out, for example, a service called Sky, it's a multi-vendor service. So you cannot just look at, G has to look at the G product, Siemens has to look at the Siemens product, so forth and so on. You have to have a very holistic approach in looking at all devices, because that's where you need to focus on to improve the risk posture. So at a very high level, I would say those are some of the key things to keep in mind, and making a business case for your board, for your executive leadership, to truly educate them and make them understand the need for investment around clinical device cybersecurity is also very critical. So I think all of those things go hand in hand to really help improve the risk posture at the end of the day.
I think those are all great tips. So thank you, Sher. A final question for you. What are some common mistakes that health delivery organizations make when considering cybersecurity, especially when it comes to Iomt?
Yeah. So look, again, I don't mean to throw anyone under the bus or put anyone down, not at all. But some common mistakes we have seen have been, there are a lot of really good tools and technologies out in the market that have been really gaining some steam, I would say, over the last 3 years or so. And one of the common mistakes I've seen is that customers sometimes, HDOs, feel that, hey, we got this tool, it has some really good AI capability, it can maybe understand some dynamics of the medical device and its behavior, and so if we implement this, we are good to go. That's a very common mistake, because that's definitely a part of the solution, but that's not the entire solution. The other thing is, the other mistake we have seen is taking IT philosophy and applying it to clinical engineering. So if you have someone who's very used to dealing with IT cybersecurity issues, and then you're putting a recommendation for some sort of a clinical device and sending that recommendation to a biomed engineer or clinical engineer, and then saying, hey, go apply this philosophy, that's a major mistake as well in some cases. Not everybody. I'm sure there are many very mature organizations who do this very effectively, but you have to be able to understand the nuances of a medical device. And then in many cases, we see mistakes made around legacy devices that have maybe out-of-date operating systems. There's no patch available. When you're coming up with a compensating control for that kind of an Iomt device, you really need to make sure you have the knowledge and the skill set around that variety of devices to do it. So not applying IT philosophy, to clinical devices as a blanket solution, and maybe not expecting a tool to solve your complete and entire issue, I think are some of the common mistakes that we've noticed with in the market.
Definitely, I have to agree. I think many organizations are starting to understand that there's no one quick fix for any of these issues, and many of them will just require a lot of collaboration. I want to hand over my next question to Seth. Thank you so much, Sher. Seth, what are some of the major regulations affecting the security of Iomt at the moment, and what would you say the biggest challenges organizations are facing to meet those regulations?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think to answer it, I'm going to step back a few steps and sort of set the stage of why security is hard in healthcare, and indeed it is very hard for all stakeholders in the supply chain. And I do very much look at healthcare cybersecurity as a supply chain issue. You've got tech supplying components and pieces and parts to medical device manufacturers, as an example. Those medical device manufacturers are then selling into hospitals, HDOs. Those HDOs are then providing, facility for patients and physicians to, treat and cure and extend life and do things like pandemic response. And all of that chain depends on a supply of technology, right? And all that technology is actually built with that healthcare focus and feature set in mind. And security is a necessary, but is a necessary part of that. However, the entire chain is optimized to deliver healthcare, right? So that's why you see why it's difficult for healthcare to do security, because healthcare does healthcare. That's what they're optimized for. So if you look at the economics of that entire supply chain, you'll find what keeps us from a steady state of cybersecurity or in a constant state of trying to figure things out. I like to think about security in the term of debt, right? That our supply chain is passing security debt onto the deliverers of healthcare. That includes hospitals, physicians, and patients. It's kind of like pollution, though. It's an externality. It's a negative externality. It's not an admonishment. It's just because we're focused on healthcare, we get the security debt out of the equation. And from a security perspective, it means that we have implicit trust, right? When I send a command or data, maybe in the form of command to a medical device and telling it to deliver insulin or deliver therapy, whether it's keeping your heart alive or delivering some analgesic through an infusion pump, that infusion pump or whatever device on the other end says, all right, I will do it. There's no authentication to that scheme because healthcare does healthcare. It's you don't want to have security hang up the delivery of healthcare. It's so critical. Yet paradoxically, yet paradoxically, and the panelists have already pointed out, they're dealing with very real threats to the healthcare delivery, right? Whether it's during pandemic or just sort of routine ransomware. So they manifest with the people that are delivering healthcare. Therefore, we focus our energy on where it's delivered, right? So 10 to $20 billion a year is spent largely by the delivery organizations on products, services, and fines, right? And the data show that that's not working, right? That we're not actually, and Sher actually pointed this out, the data show that we're actually getting worse, right? I think Ray actually even mentioned that. So what's the solution? Are we supposed to spend more money, right? I don't think we can get that. We're sort of chronically underfunded anyway because we're delivering healthcare. So what's the answer, right? So that's the kind of thing I've been thinking about. I have some ideas, but I'm certain you have some additional questions as well.
Yes, definitely. And I just wanted to add to that I see a lot of nodding heads. And tell me, do you think that we have enough security vendors that are focused on reducing security risk by building trustworthy technology, or rather building technology to simply manage security debt?
Yeah, it's part of this shift left or supply chain shift left philosophy that I've been trying to extol, right? Is that I feel like we're focused on solutions for the delivery organizations, and certainly we need those, right? It's a defense in depth strategy. But if we back up the supply chain, we go to the medical device manufacturer and say, do medical device manufacturers have enough components to pull, when they're building their clinical features, can they just pull down enough components that are secure by design or easily configurable for security that makes it easy for everybody, right? And my answer is no, but it's part of the reason why I think hub security is here, right? It's the reason why MedCrypt is doing its thing, is because that feels like the way to do it, right? To reduce the burden on the people that are focusing on the clinical delivery, like the clinical aspects, by making security a whole lot easier, because it is absolutely one of the most difficult disciplines that I've ever encountered. And I'm an organic chemist by training. I'm just like, absorbing as much security as I can. And people think organic chemistry is a hard discipline. Security, no way. Security wins by a long shot. So making that easier for everybody when they're focused on healthcare is absolutely the key. So we need more vendors in the space to focus on building secure technology from the ground up that then healthcare can absorb, eliminate debt or reduce security debt by a lot, actually.
Thank you. And tell me, do you think that we have the right active economic incentives in place to get to a steady state?
Yeah, I think that we're not fully there. So I am seeing some active market incentives right now. Because it's a negative externality that the entire healthcare ecosystem isn't necessarily incentivized to build things securely. Again, that's not pejorative. That's just because you're focused on healthcare. The FDA and other regulators play a crucial role, and this sort of gets to the original opening question, right? The FDA, and my time at the FDA was spent on building policies and sort of coaching people up that this is important. And if the regulator is a perfect place to put negative externalities and focus on that, and create sort of artificial market incentives, because we know it's important. So that's great, right? And then you see on the other side, hospitals are also saying, hey, we want security. They don't necessarily need, from my experience from folks, it's hard. It's hard to get it. It's like, what kind of security do you want for the 6,000 product types that you have in your four walls? It's very difficult to, and Sher was saying this, that it's very difficult to say exactly what you need for that heterogeneity in healthcare delivery. So saying anything like getting procurement together for a healthcare delivery organization and saying, we're not going to buy anything unless it's secure. Well, first of all, what does security actually mean? Second of all is you need that technology to deliver healthcare. So when push comes to shove, you're going to buy that device. So when it comes to active economics incentives, I've grown not to rely on HDOs to let them do healthcare for sure. To focus on folks like the FDA and other regulators, but also Congress has a role to play. And I don't know if people are familiar with it, but in end of 2020, I think it was originally a House bill, is the Iot Improvement Act of 2020. It said, if you're a IoT manufacturer and you're selling into the federal government, the NIST and other players in the space are going to define a security baseline that you have to meet before you sell into the federal government, which I think is a great way to start. Now that baseline is to be determined and is going to need a lot of work. But I think that's the correct way of supply chain shift left. You got to shift those market incentives up and make them more broad.
Definitely, and there's always room for improvement. Martin, I want to bring in your perspective as a European perspective from outside the US. We're talking about security right now, but is security a discussed issue in healthcare and government management in the Czech Republic? And is data sharing for cybersecurity and non-cyber health information being actively discussed?
Yeah, I will get to point by point. First, in the last year, we've got several big attacks on the hospitals. And successful attacks. That's what I mean. So we've got like 5 of biggest Czech hospitals which were out of order for weeks or even months. We've got a big attack on the whole Czech healthcare system in the April of the last year. Even US government recognized this and asked the other government players not to do that, not to attack healthcare system in such hard condition as COVID is. So it has become a discussed issue for the last year at least. It helped a lot for us in the hospitals that this happened, because when there's no house burning, there will be no need for firefighters. So now we've got several hospitals burning. And so it's much easier, for example, for me in my hospital to enact some security measures that were pretty hard before. And so that's the first part, data sharing. The second, we try, but our first thing we need to do is to stay operational. That's my biggest concern as a CIO in the hospital. So when G. Anthony was talking about federated machine learning, that's pretty nice. But if I use AI, then I will use it just outside of my internal network, just because I don't want to open my internal network to any attack. So that's how I have to deal with things like that.
Thank you, Martin. And what measures are you taking to mitigate the major risks in these kinds of situations?
Well, that's the basic idea, that I have to divide my concerns for those that makes my hospital operational. So the inner systems which I need for my doctors and for my other healthcare workers to work, that's on my internal network. And everything that I want to put public, like orders and reservations and even some patient information, or even usage of services like AI we've got a project where you do AI for mammography and stuff like that. then I want to use this outside of this inner perimeter and even outside of my hospital, because I've got so low resources that I'm not even able to do things like DMZ and stuff like that. So I have to have my super secure network with medical devices and stuff like that. And this network can't be open outside because I don't have resources to secure it. So everything else, which is basically not critical, because if my ordering system or reservation system falls, well, hospital still works. Maybe less people are coming in, but still we're operational. And so I put all this stuff in the cloud, which I also, as an architect, think it's the future of how to build a lot of services with all those serverless stuff and ways how to do things in cloud. So that's the basic measure I can do. I have to be super careful of how to do things.
Thank you. And from what I'm hearing, it sounds like Czech hospitals don't have enough resources for the cybersecurity posture. What do you think would help? Help you guys?
I don't know how's the situation in the United States, but in Czech Republic, we have a public healthcare system. That's the main difference from the US. And as such, our hospitals are mainly run and managed by doctors. And the situation here is the doctors don't know much about cybersecurity. Well, they don't know much about IT. They are experts in their field, which is pretty far away from IT. And usually they are from generation which has to learn how to use computers and even maybe have some problems with it. So the biggest issue with resources is how to convince these people, our stakeholders, that, well, this is really an issue. And that's why I said that last year pretty much helped, because they've seen it's an issue when the neighboring hospital stops working for 7 weeks, as it happened to us. So yeah, but where the resources are very few, because all the system is in very harsh condition now with COVID and stuff like that. And the stakeholders don't see IT as the thing that they want to invest in. In our hospital, buying a new RTG or CT or anything is much more important than to do anything about cyber or even about IT.
Thank you, Martin. I want to get into Q&A in a second because we have some really interesting questions coming in. But I have a final question here in our discussion for David Hochhauser. Tell me, are you seeing major differences between US and European healthcare with respect to security?
Some, and I'll divert for one quick side comment to the question. I don't recall the television show, but there was a television series a few years ago that had major scenes in it from the vice president of the US was actually being blackmailed and was eventually killed by breaking in through his pacemaker monitoring system and killing him. So the only reason I mention that is several people mentioned the issue about getting awareness and getting funding. And just as one potential way is maybe I'll find the series, maybe let them sit down and see this television show and they'll start to realize a little bit more of the risk involved may help. That actually covers both. But as far as differences in European and US healthcare, there's huge things that are obviously in common across both, and the sharing of data I think would be enormous. Two areas that there are some additional areas that come apart is there are differences in the data privacy laws. Obviously, Europe has GDPR and some very strict regulations. There's HIPAA over here. So they're both strong, but there are a little bit differences in some of those things. And I think probably the major difference is some of the things is the public versus private healthcare system. some of the things I start to see is some additional areas around doing things with automation and AI and automation and cost reductions, sharing of information might be more critical in the US just because cost reduction is such a major area of this. And so I think some of those specific cases, as you get into some detail, some specific use cases may start varying a little bit as well. That said, I do want to be a little bit cautious on that because it's kind of somewhat my opinion, and I'm just haven't seen all of that in detail yet, but I suspect that, and that's kind of some of the things that I'm, starting to be alert for a little bit more around those areas.
Yeah, and we have an attendee that's sharing that this example of that you gave of the pacemaker was Dick Cheney, who was on 60 Minutes, and spoke briefly about that. Yeah, so thank you, Chip.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
That saved me some time.
Well, I'd like a quick Google search. So I'd like to jump into Q&A, and we have a lot of really great questions, some for specific panelists, and some are just open-ended. So I'm going to shoot them, and if any of you would like to answer them, feel free to jump in, and feel free to respond to one another as well. I guess I'll just start off with a question for Sher. One of our attendees would like to know, how is GE Healthcare planning to manage cybersecurity of medical devices that are already in the market and comply with post-market cybersecurity guidelines by the FDA?
Yeah, great question. We absolutely, of course, abide by all regulations, whether it's the FDA or other regional requirements as well, from GDPR to other areas, like even some call out in the Middle East as well. But really what we do is we work on three key areas from a cybersecurity perspective. One is secure design. One is secure through the life cycle. And the third is by providing managed medical device cybersecurity services. So we definitely comply with all FDA regulations with regards to devices that are in the marketplace, with regards to any kind of patch application, patch applicability. Of course, there's different SLAs with regards to the timelines of, which is a critical patch, how quickly that needs to be applied into the field. But I'll see if I can share the link for our managed cybersecurity, because for many of the devices that are several years old and there is no patch application from Microsoft or whatever have you, those are the kind of devices where we come back and really help the customer with through a managed cybersecurity service.
Great, thank you, Sher.
Yeah.
I've got a question here for you, Seth. Seth, what are medical device manufacturers doing to improve the embedded security in new devices? In the industry, we are so used to blaming the manufacturers for security issues and the difficulty to reduce the risk around them.
Yeah, great question. I'll start with the last point first. That and indeed, right, that manufacturers have a job to do to increase the security posture of any product that they're producing. There's also an expectation on the delivery side that there's got to be some additional defense in depth measures, additional perimeter security, network security type techniques. So it's definitely a partnership. My time at the FDA in focus on medical device manufacturers, and indeed, what we're trying to do at MedCrypt is focus on how do you, one, establish roots of trust or trustworthy devices, right? How do you get features onto a device that make it secure by design? And in some cases, that's super challenging. So in the embedded space, obviously have constraints over compute power, memory, and things like that, especially on fielded devices that have already been architected and not necessarily provided for additional resources. So I think the ways that manufacturers are going about fixing that, I'm sure Sher could kick in here as well, right, is that you have to develop, I talked about the mentality of healthcare, right? There's a shift going on right now in that a lot of medical device manufacturers are getting their feet under them to understand and develop devices, whether they're embedded or not, under a secure development lifecycle, right? That instead of focusing entirely on safety or the clinical feature, the security has to be ingrained, embedded to, I guess, to a pun, I don't know if that was a pun or not, very bad pun, embedded into the DNA of the company, where safety and effectiveness had been previously, and quality. So I think, how are they doing that? I think the way to build secure devices is known, right? Like the tools are out there, the techniques, secure coding, I think I saw mentioned in the chat, right? It can be done. Sher even mentioned, how do you modify, say, an typical IT solution like PKI is a great example, right? PKI, traditional IT, it's connected in terms of key management, things like that. Well, who's thinking about how you do PKI for things that are maybe semi-connected, or maybe they're not connected? So how do you establish roots of trust in a non-connected environment, right? Those are the types of things that manufacturers have to deal with on a daily basis to do that securely. So not only are they dealing with organizationally getting their feet under them, but also the technological challenges while solutions exist, sort of, modifying them for applicability towards their clinical domain.
Yeah, if I could just add one comment to just what Seth said, and I agree with him 100%. Just on at this point, looking at what's happening in the industry, you have to make those investments if you're a OEM or a medical device manufacturer in the secure design framework, right? So at G Healthcare, we have over the last several years been investing a lot from an engineering standpoint, because I think a comment that Seth made was right on the money, that how we used to engineer, a paternal infant care, product, or an MR or a patient monitoring system 15 years ago is completely different than how we do it now, because in GE, we've been investing at the engineering level to make sure that through the life cycle of product engineering, you have security, as he mentioned, embedded into that process. Because if you don't do that in this day and age, I think there's a whole lot of risk you're putting your customers through if you're putting out devices that way. So the question that even came earlier, I think on the GE front, was about devices in the marketplace. But just to piggyback off of Seth's comment, new devices, it's a must. This is not even you can't compromise from cost, margin, none of that. It is a must play to have secure development lifecycle built into the product engineering lifecycle when you're building new devices. And that's something that we take very seriously at G Healthcare.
Great. Thank you, Sher, for jumping in.
Sure.
I got a question for Martin. Any thoughts on a zero trust model for identities, and would that help reduce the need for a fully trusted internal network?
Sorry, what was the second part?
If you had any thoughts on a zero trust model for identities, and if that would help reduce the need for a fully trusted internal network?
Well, we don't have fully trusted internal network. Of course, we have segmentation and we've got other stuff, but we know it's not enough. We know that we've got, as other mentioned, the medical devices, as is mentioned in the chat, it's a whole different issue. We've got out-of-date operating systems using these medical devices. And we know that this network is vulnerable. It's very much vulnerable. Though we have segmentation and stuff like that, and we won't lose it all, it's still vulnerable. So I don't think it's possible for us in the near future to have the resources to secure it and be able to connect it. And it doesn't mean you can't connect from the inner network out. So we're still vulnerable. It's not like we have a security agency with totally disconnected internal network and stuff like that. But we just don't expose any any ports out. We don't expose anything out. Any connection has to be made from the hospital to the outside world and not the other way.
Great, thank you, Martin. I have a question for all of you, so feel free to jump in, but one of our attendees is asking, who should own medical data and why? And I think that's a really great question. And maybe David, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. And I'm actually very interested to hear everybody else's opinion.
Definitely.
On that question. So, you know, I mean, I know there are initiatives both from one, the individual has to me, in my opinion, at least at a minimum, approve the use of it, who actually owns it. And I think in one sense should actually own it. And there are, you know, efforts to say, well, you hold on to your own medical record and you share it with somebody else. There are others that are more central. Does the hospital that you go to own some of the data? And I don't have a definitive approach. That the consumer, I think, needs to at least approve it, but the data is so complex and so voluminous when you're going between one place to the next. I think the healthcare organization has to at least take a responsibility of owning the responsibility of protecting it and transferring it and making sure that permission is there to get to the next place. If you ever go through that effort of having to transfer medical history from one place to the next, you can see it's not an easy task. So my opinion is probably a combination of approval, but I think the complexity and the magnitude has to be the responsibility of the healthcare. But I certainly would love to hear from other people on here.
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
I think, David, you're spot on, right? At the end of the day, the patient, the consumer needs to own the data. Whether or not they're the steward and shepherd of their data is a whole nother story. And I think we need to look at the delineation between ownership and stewardship. And the HDOs need to be the stewards of that data. And I, as a customer or consumer, should have the authority to consent my data to do certain things, right? Whether that's research, whether that's donation, whether that is applicability to population health. And there's a lot of discussion going on about how to monetize that to help people pay for medicine in the United States, where there is such a huge cost gap. But I think at the end of the day, I also should be able to, at the stroke of a button, be able to extract my information from the stewarding organization and take it in a single common format to another organization. And that type of data democracy is something we all should be pushing for. But with it comes, to I think everybody's points on this panel, a tremendous amount of privacy and security issues and stakes that come at hand. But I think we need to move past the day of the healthcare organization or Epic or Cerner or any of the EHRs or any of the CROs owning our data, monetizing our data, and using that data in a way that we may not have consented to or understand consent to. And I think as a corollary, there was another question asked about, you know, the education. And I think that literacy piece is also a role of the stewardship organization, right? The steward needs to help educate and make literate the consumer about what they have and what they don't have. And I think that is something that we as professionals and we as consumers should really be vocal about having in this entire environment.
I like what Ray said. Oh, go ahead, Tony.
Well, I was just going to make a point about it. You know, it's kind of it's a difficult question to answer, right? In one sense, because what is dead data, right? Like, so you know, if you've pseudo-anonymized data, if you've anonymized data, and you can use that for some good, you know, does ownership is a less interesting question, right? It becomes more about what are you doing or who's using the data and what are you trying to achieve. And I think that's an important part of it as well.
I just wanted to remark on what I agree with Ray's kind of differentiation between the shepherd and the owner, and I completely agree. But it reminds me of the one kind of issue. So the Department of Defense had an issue with their two different healthcare EHRs, one for the VA system and one for the actual active duty Department of Defense. And so when a service member would retire and have to basically transfer their medical records from the active duty Department of Defense system, health records into the VA, it was not a seamless transition. They ended up, I think, I don't know where it stands now, but I know this was during the Bush administration, and it was basically from the top down. The Gates said, you know, this will happen. You will reconcile these two systems, so it's easy for a service member to move over. I think they spent several years and several $1 million trying to do it, and they threw up their hands and said, we don't think this can be done. It's not an easy process, and that should be an easy process to do, to move from kind of, if you're going to shepherd your own data from one system to the other.
But I think, Tony, to that point, though, there is a lack of standardization that goes from EHR to EHR, system to system, organization to organization. And without some sort of standardized governance, and in the States, a national patient index or ID, what a concept that would be. You know, the patient matching issues and all of these other things. I think being able to do that is where we need to start in order to be able to share data, be interoperable, be portable throughout the network, regardless of who we're seeing, is something that we've got to focus on. But to your point, the moment of inertia of doing that is enormous, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We have to expend so much energy and so much effort to do it, and there's no incentivization to do it yet.
Yeah.
Martin, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just wanted to say that here in Europe, we've got GDPR, and this whole ownership and stewardship of data question is pretty much solved for us. So maybe it's a good way how to look at it for you other guys in the US.
The only thing that, and one other point to add to is, I was speaking to somebody from the Association of Artificial Intelligence for Healthcare, an organization, and they said, you know, there are a lot of privacy laws dealing obviously with data, but in some cases, do we need to loosen them in some cases? For example, for medical research where there's huge value, we need to maybe protect the identity, but maybe we need to be able to share the data more than some of the privacy laws are enabling. And that's actually a tough balance. And they actually have a group that's focused on both technically how to do it and on policy on dealing with some of the value. And then somebody else even here I saw wrote on, well, what if you financially start to incent people? Then you start getting into discrepancies. Wait, are the poor people going to share their data and the richer people not? You know, if you look at age differences, I generally, and I like to generalize, but younger people tend not to think about privacy as much as when you get older. If for those who have kids, you know, you see they'll share anything online, you know. So there might need to be some more discussion on some of the privacy related issues around it, because there is some value in certain things, and there are some issues that may come up around being able to just give, say you have permission and control.
Definitely. And I want to jump on to our next question, because I think this is a pretty big topic in itself. We got a question here, and I'm going to, again, shoot this to anybody, so feel free to answer. How are you handling the breach that was verified by the NSA on 60 Minutes last Sunday, that verified over 18,000 companies around the world were infiltrated? FireEye was the company that caught the breach. Of course, I think the attendee is referring to the SolarWinds attack. And they're asking, how are you tracking the breach at your own companies internally?
I'm happy to go first. So, I think I mentioned earlier on, we're part of H-ISAC, so we get a sense of, what the whole kind of all the members from a healthcare perspective are trying to do. So, I think it's fair to say that it's reasonably sophisticated or highly sophisticated attack, that even some of the main players like the attendee mentioned, FireEye, Microsoft, and others have been impacted. It's taken a bit of effort to untangle the attack itself and how it was conducted. So, I mean, beyond kind of the initial incident response stuff that you would do, if you were a SolarWinds customer, it's more kind of a wait and see and try and understand what the threat actor has been after, what other victims have materialized. But I think there's probably more to go in this story, and if not a movie out of this.
I definitely think it's a wake-up call for many organizations. Someone else want?
Yeah, this is Seth. So we're a company that makes software. So obviously we're looking into this, right? Because part of that attack, I don't know if it was directly related or not, was that I think SolarWinds build system got infiltrated, right? Well, who doesn't use a build system? And by the way, who is building their own build system? I'm pretty sure that if you make software, you probably use some commercial variety of build system, right? So this is what I'm getting at in terms of supply chain attacks, right? If you think about the whole thing, like there's people making software everywhere in healthcare, right? And they're going to be using a build system of some flavor, right? So if you aren't thinking about if that build system company, the people that are building that piece of software for the build system aren't thinking about security, right? Then we absorb that technical and security debt, right? So we have to shift left, right? Where it's not just healthcare that has laws on the books for security. It's got to be the component manufacturers and tech that are also on the books and responsible for, looking at that from a security point of view.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I was going to just briefly add was it's also, SolarWinds clearly is monitoring software, but think of all the other software that enterprises use that might touch large amounts of systems from, ITSM, discovery, vulnerability management, backups, the auto RPA or anything else that might have credential stores. Like they're, as Seth mentioned, high candidates for this style of attack as well.
Okay, I have another question here, which I'm just going to shoot out to you. Where do you see OT cybersecurity in the next 3 years as a major vector of attack on healthcare systems? We have seen this with Sandworm and now with SolarWinds attack. How are we going to need to look at this in a new/old as a new/old vector within the healthcare sector?
Yeah, I can take a stab. I very, OT operational tech, I very much view medical devices in that realm. Yeah, I think, I mentioned it, Sher, it's got things, jumping over there at GE. There are 10 to 13,000 medical device manufacturers, right? So this is just medical devices, right? This is not talking about any other technologies that Martin and folks are going to use to deliver healthcare. To about 10 to 13,000 medical device manufacturers. Getting them to understand that security is getting them to fit security within their scope of business is absolutely a challenge. And until we somehow resolve that with sufficient market incentives, OT, as it pertains to medical devices, will be a significant attack vector. Whether you're causing harm, like in the Homeland Security, using it against heads of state, which is a possibility, or more probably that you're using it as a vector to disable operations within the healthcare environment. That will be the main style of attack until we reach some sort of steady state.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think I shared some statistics earlier on as well, right? Just look at the trend. And I think, Seth, you mentioned this as well. It's not like we're getting better at it. Just the environment and the multitude and the different types of OT devices within within you know, an HDO is just it's only going to grow. It's only going to grow. So I think definitely I agree that not even 3 years. I think we're already seeing it now, but even in the next couple, 3 years, 4 years, you'll see just this getting tougher and tougher. And of course, all of us, our hopes are that, you know, none of that in turn at the end of the day impacts any person. But we've seen the unintended consequences of the issue in Germany, for example, right? You heard about that, right? Where they had to deviate because the hospital's OR functionality was down, and they had to deviate the patient somewhere else. So, I mean, it's very unfortunate, but it is happening. It's happening today. It will increase. And think about it this way. I think somebody mentioned this in the chat box, and I completely agree with them. This OT space, if you're a bad actor, and there are a lot of really great ethical hackers that, you know, have demonstrated this, it is way simpler to create havoc in that space than to potentially do it in some other areas as well. So I think the vulnerability aspect is pretty massive. And if you don't have a very mature, holistic setup to combat it, then a lot of bad actors can get a field day and then just do what they need to do. And we're seeing that, unfortunately, in a lot of different places. And the biggest challenge is, again, I think Seth mentioned that if you take medical devices as part of this OT space, right, you have a potential for a direct impact to patient safety and patient care. And I think Martin said it, right? Operationally, he wants to make sure that everything is good. That's priority, right? And so this is definitely going to be a major problem for everyone to deal with for some time to come.
Anyone else want to jump?
Oh, I'm sorry. And one other thing to add, there's also, there's the devices. There's also a lot of automation and filtering of that data, both from controlling the devices and the data coming out of it. You know, it's really one connected group that I look at. You have to protect the devices. Then you have, on the edge, you have sitting analytic boxes, monitoring machines. That's one way of breaking down. You shut down the monitoring, the cyber threat monitoring. You give somebody a lot of time to place an undetected advanced persistent threat inside the system, for example. So you need to protect the device. You need to protect, then when you have 5G coming in and you have a volume of data, you're going to have more monitoring and more analysis occurring even closer. So you'll have things that don't have the security of a data center, even more things proliferating. So it all proliferates from the devices through the monitoring devices there through, now you get to transfer that information back into the data center. And that whole path needs to be closely secured as well. There's a lot of points of entry to break in and not just going directly to some of the devices.
Yeah, I think, David, to your point, right, being able to manage edge to core to cloud is paramount in healthcare. And I think it's a completely different perspective than what we've looked at in the past. And trying to do it again, going back to Sher's discussion and Seth's discussion about being holistic in our perspective, we've got to be able to wrap it all together, but also differentiate what's going on in embedded systems with what's going on in traditional IT. And we're starting to see it in pharma too, right? As you get more and more edge compute and edge work being done, we've got to be able to look at it holistically, but partition it effectively.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
One thing I wanted to point out with moving things left, which I totally agree, the one issue that, or one kind of thing that I always kind of run up against is that customers always talk about wanting things to be faster, smaller, lower power. Security is like the thing that's lowest down on the list, even though it should be the highest on the list. And I sort of think of Martin kind of with, you know, the people who are actually making the decisions in the C-suite might not really understand that, might just assume, oh, it's secure, it's fine, it's secure. And so when they make their purchasing decisions, they're making them for the wrong reason. And so it really helps when I go to my execs and say, no, we need to actually move stuff to make it easier for the security, even though it's going to add to the cost of the system. It's really what the system needs. It's not a nice to have kind of feature.
Thank you, G. I got a few more questions here. This one's for Sher. Sher, you've talked about tools. Can you share some light on selection criteria? You made an interesting point. IT security is different from device security. How can one evaluate monitoring tools?
Look, it's a good question. And again, I'm not putting down the tool. So I didn't mean to insinuate that that is the route to go. But look, there are many tools that you can leverage out there. I don't want it to be a miss. I know I feel like I'm a broken record here, and a lot of us have said this, but folks, you got to take a holistic approach to this one. But if you are looking to arm your team with a tool, obviously on the IT side, there are many fantastic technology and tools that have been around for a long time. But on the Iomt, IoT side, what I would say is make sure whichever tools you're looking at or you go with, you pilot them for a good amount of time. And by that, I mean, at least 90 days. And you pilot them in collaboration with your clinical engineering team. Because if you're looking at tools and solutions that are pertinent to your IoT, OT space, there's a lot of claims out there about they have, there's AI capability that can understand behaviors of devices, and they can provide certain recommendations that will just, solve your issue. But once you play around with them in collaboration with your clinical engineering team, that's, I think, when you will have some very solid feedback on what's real, what's maybe a little bit more on the marketing front, and what gaps will you still have at the end of the day, which should be part of your purchasing decision. So just to finish that, I would just say, make sure as you're looking at it, collaborate with between IT and clinical engineering on that pilot.
Great, thank you so much, Sher. And actually, I think we're almost out of time in just a few minutes. The clock was ticking, I lost track. But I wanted to just say thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. We have so many more questions, so I hope we get to do something like this again. It's such an important and relevant topic right now. So a big thank you to David Hochhauser, Tony Reina, Sher Baig, Tony Clarke, Martin Konish, Seth Carmody, and Ray Deote. And we hope you're all staying safe and healthy. To get in touch with today's panelists, you can feel free to reach out to them directly. All of today's attendees will be receiving an email in the coming days with the contact information of each of our panelists. So don't be afraid to drop them a line if you have any further questions on any of today's topics. And to stay up to date with Hub Security, I feel this is really rushed. I'm really sorry, guys. This was a really great discussion, but to stay up to date, you can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. And again, just wanted to give a big thank you to all of our panelists today. Thank you for taking the time to discuss these topics with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us.
And maybe one day we can continue this in person.
That would be nice.
Thank you very
Have a
much.
good day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Be safe. Bye.
Bye.